The most talked about murder trial of 2026 isn't just about true crime. The tragic loss of life is the obvious news headline, and no one doubts that. But the deeper story is that the case is a blatant public example of the state of Western medicine and polypharmacy inside of healthcare. Welcome to sammillerscience, where you're joining me nearly 2 decades into my personal journey to bridge the gap between macros, metabolism, muscle, and medicine. If you're joining me, thanks for trusting me to elevate your health and realize your true potential. Each week and inside every episode, I'll be sharing methods and models from my coaching journey and my personal experience, as well as the science that you need to achieve whatever specific goals you're working on in your life. Let's jump in to today's show. A woman who is roughly 8 months postpartum with a psychiatric medication history that reportedly moved through more than a dozen prescriptions in just a matter of months. These medications were started, they were stopped, swapped, and layered at different times while she was caring for 3 children under the age of 5. Whether you think the defense is right or wrong isn't what I'm covering today, and that's not the focus of the episode. And I'm certainly not relitigating a criminal case on a nutrition and health-focused show. The loss of 3 children here is a public tragedy that a generation will remember. But my focus here is on the state of our health system. Roughly a quarter of American adults are taking 5 or more prescription medications at the same time. That number comes out of national survey data, and the picture shows up in Medicare data and in the European population studies as well. So it's not just an artifact of the Western insurance system. Past the age of 40, the proportion of individuals on 5 or more medications climbs even more steeply, and in the Medicare age data sets, you're looking at a very large share of the population, especially the baby boomers and beyond. The group I want you paying attention to here, though, is also younger women. With the rise of hormonal birth control, thyroid medication, maybe an asthma inhaler, a prescription for migraines, the rise of antidepressants or something for anxiety. Each one of these is being prescribed by a different clinician or provider for a different complaint, and they're each added to a medication list rather than replacing anything that's already on it. Now, in pregnancy and postpartum, this doesn't necessarily lessen any of that. In plenty of cases, the list grows through that window because it brings new complaints from the patient, new clinicians during that time, and the frequency of OB care, and a compressed timeline for deciding what matters. Health systems have written entire national guidance documents whose only job is managing the resulting mess with multiple medications, which is the clearest evidence you'll find that this is actually a problem and it's the standard rather than being an exception to the rule. The NICE NG56 criteria in the UK covers multimorbidity and the medication burden that comes with it. Scotland even publishes standalone polypharmacy guidance with a 7-step review process inside of it. The American Geriatrics Society maintains the Beers criteria and a running list of medications that's potentially inappropriate in older or elderly adults. And Ireland gave us the stop and start criteria for what to consider stopping and what might be missing in these medication protocols. Nobody builds 4 national frameworks or international frameworks for a rare event. The other thing to understand is that polypharmacy isn't just a psychiatry story like we've seen in this case. It pops up in type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, oncology, autoimmune conditions, chronic pain, and also pregnancy. If somebody suggests that long medication list by itself indicates something unusual about a patient, the prescribing data doesn't necessarily support that. Concurrent prescribing is widespread across every specialty that manages chronic conditions in Western healthcare. This doesn't mean doctors are bad or that there's never a need for a single medication. That's not what I'm saying here. But a primary care physician has roughly 15 minutes, a patient with maybe 3 or 4 complaints. They may not have insurance coverage or the ability to cash pay for a 45-minute nutrition and lifestyle conversation. And the doctor has a prescription pad that produces measurable change within a matter of weeks. And that's how these medications stack. But then the side effects stack too. One piece of this story and trial that deserves more attention specifically is the endocrine picture, because thyroid function, prolactin, and psychiatric symptoms are not completely separate systems. Thyroid dysfunction, particularly hypothyroidism, has a well-established association with depression. A 2021 systematic review in the Journal of the American Medical Association focused on psychiatry found that hypothyroidism was associated with clinical depression, with the relationship stronger in women and in overt hypothyroidism. It's particularly relevant in a postpartum context because pregnancy and The time period surrounding delivery are periods of enormous endocrine changes, and postpartum thyroiditis affects an estimated 5 to 10% of women, often progressing through a hypothyroid phase during the first postpartum year. Some of the symptoms of hypothyroidism include fatigue, cognitive slowing, impaired concentration, sleep disturbances, brain fog, and depressed mood. These can all substantially overlap with some of the symptoms that people report under psychiatric care or in a counseling session. There's also an important biological connection between thyroid function and prolactin, which is already elevated in a postpartum setting, especially for women who are breastfeeding. In primary hypothyroidism, reduced thyroid hormone causes the brain to increase thyrotropin-releasing hormone, or TRH. TRH stimulates TSH, but it can also stimulate prolactin, meaning hypothyroidism itself can contribute to elevated prolactin. And this is an important distinction because prolactin doesn't exist in isolation either. It impacts both the reproductive system, thyroid physiology, and more. In cases where there's a significant hyperprolactinemia, that can also suppress the reproductive hormone axis, altering estrogen signaling in women. Some psychiatric medications, particularly certain dopamine-blocking antipsychotics, can also substantially elevate prolactin. That's more just for your general knowledge than medical purposes, and not necessarily something that was in every aspect of this case. Given the importance of these deeper layers of health, it's crucial to establish a physiological baseline or metabolic status quo beyond just hormones. And so by that, I mean a full picture of physiology taken before the first prescription gets written. So everything after that point has something to be compared against and basically serving as your baseline or benchmark rather than the monitoring or the blood work that only gets ordered once a medication is already running and in place. Micronutrient status is also important here because it appears to be one modifiable contributor to depression risk rather than a standalone cause, and it can also make existing depression worse. A woman finishing pregnancy has lost blood at delivery. She's run a 9-month nutrient transfer to a fetus. She's often lactating and maybe sleeping in 90-minute fragments, and sleep's a whole nother story here too. Deficiencies in iron, vitamin D, folate, B12, zinc, and magnesium have all been associated with depressive symptoms, and correcting a true deficiency may improve mood or reduce symptom burden in some patients. That becomes particularly relevant postpartum when nutritional demands, blood loss, and endocrine changes can all increase vulnerability. Iron deficiency without frank anemia is also common after delivery and produces fatigue, irritability, and poor concentration. So an iron deficiency, along with a thyroid issue, you have a lot of this clinical overlap with some of the psychiatric symptoms that have been described. Low B12 produces mood changes and neurological symptoms as well and is a nutrient of risk and concern. And every one of these nutrients and biomarkers overlaps almost perfectly with the symptom list that gets a psychiatric prescription written, but in-depth labs are incredibly rare. Anyone with fatigue, mood, sleep, or body composition complaints who's never had a full panel needs this comprehensive data to understand their health and their risk factors. For a postpartum woman, it becomes even important to push harder for these labs because the 6-week visit in this country is often a single conversation, and very rarely is there any type of blood work attached to it. So a woman can go the entire first year postpartum and have 3 prescriptions written and maybe not even have a single lab test or comprehensive lab draw. Some example markers of concern that I think everyone should pay attention to, but especially women in this case, would be your CBC and CMP. So that's a complete blood count and metabolic panel, your TSH, free T3, free T4, prolactin, total iron binding capacity, ferritin, serum iron, and percent saturation. Vitamin D and highly sensitive C-reactive protein are important as well. In addition to getting the lab set and having the data to be informed about your health, it's also important to know there's nutrition and lifestyle factors that can decrease depression rates as well. The Mediterranean diet reduced depression by roughly 47% on average. That's not just a marginal change. That's a first-line intervention, and it really doesn't get discussed enough compared to the prevalence of prescription medications. Exercise also shows up in research as something that can be 1.5 times more effective than SSRIs at relieving mild to moderate depression, which means if you've got a client who's on an antidepressant or a friend who's on an antidepressant or you're on an antidepressant for mild depression and no exercise recommendation was given, you're missing the intervention that has the strongest evidence behind it. So that's not just me being anti-medication. That's established data and research that's very clear about what works in this instance. There's also evidence to support light therapy. Light therapy produces significant clinical improvements in up to about 50% of patients, comparable to antidepressants themselves, and it's very affordable, which means it belongs in the conversation before we're 6 months into a medication list with 5 prescriptions written. None of this changes what a physician needs to prescribe or when psychiatric medication saves lives. But it does change what we can do for our own health, or if you're someone who's in the health industry as a coach, you work in fitness and nutrition, it's just an example that there are things that can be used besides pills that actually work when it comes to physical and mental health. Unfortunately, we built a healthcare culture that's very good at adding, and adding is fast, it's measurable and reimbursable by insurance. And in an emergency, sometimes it saves lives, but almost nobody inside of this Western care system is paid to delayer or build health from the ground up. So using food, training, sleep, in some cases, supplementation, or even understanding what was going on with a person's physiology before some of these medications were prescribed. A medication list that reaches 7 pills is rarely ever just one bad decision. It's a series of short-term decisions made by different clinicians who each saw one slice of the person, and nobody really looked at the whole picture. They weren't talking to each other or communicating super well either. This Clancy case serves not just as true crime, but a cautionary tale and powerful lesson on the prevalence of polypharmacy, which I've even seen firsthand with my family members as well. If you're a coach, you are one of the very few people who's a part of a client's life who can see every week for a year. You're able to see patterns, and those things aren't identifiable in a short 10 to 15 minute appointment. That doesn't mean that health coaches or just your average person has prescribing authority to override this, and it doesn't make the everyday person or someone listening to this on YouTube or Spotify, it doesn't make you a physician. But everybody should understand their health baseline. And that starts with things like labs and leaning into the lifestyle factors that can truly make a difference when it comes to our health. If you enjoyed today's show, if it changed your perspective, if you learned something new or had a greater level of understanding of the hormonal factors that can drive a part of this picture, please share the show with someone who would benefit, or post this on your social and tag me at sammillerscience. That's my handle on just about every major platform. Many of you are not subscribed, so smash that subscribe button to make sure you never miss an episode and get first dibs on all of our latest research and metabolic health updates. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next episode.